complexity which surrounds actors which extend far beyond Islamic State, and the vast and diverse concept of Islamic governance today as it's been interpreted and applied by other actors. So in this sleek little volume, we have 16 chapters across 450 pages, authored by ourselves and an excellent range of global experts in the book, which look at cases as diverse as the Muslim Brotherhood, the Taliban, Hamas, Al-Shabaab, and Islamist groups in Mali, which we'll hear a little bit about today, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham in Syria, the Houthis in Yemen, and Jamaat al-Islamiyah in Pakistan, amongst others. And what's unique about this is that these Islamist actors, they are not the same by any stretch, and they often very much differ on issues of interest to them. They range from differences pertaining to civic and administrative construction of the state, the use of violence, the exercise and rotation of power, how they interpret and codify Islamic jurisprudence. And we really showcase throughout the book those who both pursue legitimate and legal projects, and then also those non-state actors who pursue their visions through violence. And we look at these in different environments at different times, and how they've approached different aspects of Islamist governance. And just to clarify, when we talk about Islamists, and a lot of this is building up off of a lot of the excellent work that Shiraz has done over the years as well, we treat Islamists as those who believe Islam to be a comprehensive political ideology. They place us at the center of their identity, at the most significant or only source. They regard the political realm as needing to distinguish between Muslims and the rest. They revert to scriptural authority, however interpreted, either loosely or dogmatically, inspirationally, or in a doctrinal form, as a sole or primary source of law. And they believe in an Islamic model as being necessarily distinct and opposed to legislative systems based on human reasoning, public opinion, and social consensus when considering issues related to morality and ethics. And finally, they believe that the purpose of a political system is to satisfy the concept of tawhid, or monotheism of Allah, while simultaneously offering citizens a program that focuses on the doctrine of salvation. And I think if we use the concept of communist ideology, if you talk about communism, you can think about the really wide range of case studies and actors that are connected by the same ideology. And we really kind of reflect that same approach in this book. They are all connected by a singular ideology, but incredibly different cases and actors. We also make a point in the book not to make a value judgment on Islamist actors. I think that's quite important. It's really an attempt to consider what these groups are trying to achieve and how they're trying to achieve it. And there were several overarching guiding questions in the book. So what does Islamist governance look like in practical terms? What tactics have different groups employed in the pursuit of governance to their goals? How is this supported or detracted from their fortunes? And what were the main factors that influenced the evolution or change within different groups? And we looked at 4 thematic approaches in the book, and the chapters are organized under these thematic approaches. We look at first the constitutionalist means to achieve these goals. So the actors who used their commitment to and participation in a prevailing constitutional order. The second group we looked at, or the thematic approach, I should say, was the diverse ways in which groups have sought to gain legitimacy through their governance. The third theme was social welfare activism, or the softer aspects of governance, which are implemented as part of the broader governance efforts. And underpinning all 3 of these themes is the question of what choices and pathways have meant for these diverse actors. So what has this meant locally, nationally, and internationally? How has it ultimately understood and interacted with and responded to events outside of those borders as well? And our final theme considers the tussle between Islamist actors and the state, recognizing that Islamist actors don't operate in a vacuum, and they instead find themselves in a constant state of flux with states and state actors, which creates a dynamic in exchange between the two of them. So the other point that I think is quite useful to highlight here as well is that when we look at those 2 types of actors that I've just mentioned, those constitutional actors who pursue legitimate political avenues to affect change, their goal is really to develop a more distinctly Islamic form of education or social welfare, judiciaries, and banking, alongside recalibrating policy goals in line with ostensibly Muslim causes such as Palestine or Kashmir. And they notably pursue these goals through political agitation by publicly criticizing the prevailing norms and status quo, and by holding rallies and participating in elections. So things that are considered legal approaches to trying to drive political change. But I think what we have quite a few detailed cases as well as of those who would use violence through insurgent or terrorist means to force change. And again, cases like ISIS, the Taliban are ones that immediately come to mind. And these groups have really tended to grow from ongoing civil wars in the regions or political tensions, again, in the areas that they come from. And we draw on two bodies of literature in this as well. We both look at Islamic studies, which focus on Islamism as discussed above, but also rebel governance. And that's particularly pertinent to the case of non-state actors who pursue terrorist and violent means to pursue their political agendas. And rebel governance is really broadly defined as the set of actions insurgents engage with to regulate political and social and economic life of non-combatants during war. And it opens up multiple underexplored avenues in the rebel-civilian relationship. And we really drew off of authors such as Mampilli, which have really kind of shaped this field. But the study of rebel governance really helps us understand specific aspects of civil wars more broadly, and aspects like violence and recruitment and strategies and how they fund themselves. And the kind of social transformations, political mobilizations, and so forth, state building concepts and war making more generally. And rebels also engage in practices that mirror the state. They have symbols and symbolic processes and elections and diplomacy. And we draw on, again, an excellent range of scholars that have built up this field and use it to inform our approach for non-state actors in their pursuit of Islamist governance. We also consider areas that are relevant to our discussion, including governance as a strategic choice, constitutionalism, legitimacy, and social welfare activism. And those are, in fact, some of the thematic areas our book is divided into. So I think that's probably enough to summarize some of the motivating thoughts and structures that underpin our book here. But I'm going to hand it over to Shiraz now to discuss a little bit more in detail some of the kind of case studies and some of the key findings that we made throughout the book. So I think without further ado, Shiraz, I'll hand it back to you here.
Thanks very much, Joanna. Can everyone see me? I think there was this issue before, but I'll proceed unless I hear otherwise. So as mentioned by Joanna, the sort of, I suppose the impetus for where this book came from was the 2011 uprisings, but that was just one event. Even within the last 20 years, of course, that had a huge impact on the shape and contours of what might be very broadly termed as political Islam. And that was, of course, the 9/11 attacks and then 2011 uprisings. And these two events have really shaped and molded, in a sense, the last 2 decades, both of the phenomenon in terms of how it's presented itself, but also had a pretty profound role in shaping the contours of power and contestations of power within the broader Muslim world. So what I'm going to do is to present the sort of 30,000, 40,000 foot view on what's happened, what the sort of broad headwinds have been in regards to that, before handing over to my colleagues who will present 2 of the case studies. And of course, we assemble 16 case studies, as Joanna mentioned, within the book, pulling together a very, very diverse geographical range in order to help you, I suppose, get a better understanding and assessment of the way that different movements have been reacting to what's happening in their localities. And again, I think that in and of itself is quite important. We talk about this notion of there being a global jihad movement, but of course, the shape, manner, and form of those movements and the way they were acting and operating on the ground takes on highly localized characteristics, both in terms of the way those groups are manifesting themselves, but also interacting with the state wherever they happen to be. And so we've got case studies ranging all the way from Indonesia through to Tunisia and elsewhere. So as you can see, a pretty broad sweep of the world going on there. I think it's important when we take a step back to think to that sort of immediate post 9/11 environment. We've of course just had the anniversary a few days ago of that. But when George Bush sort of stood up and declared this moment of there being a global war on terror, he was really speaking about one organization, this thing called Al-Qaeda, which hadn't sort of achieved popular notoriety beyond the sort of small community of people who knew what it was and who were looking at it. And so you had this quiet sort of pyramid-like structure with this guy at the top called Osama bin Laden, and so on. And then sort of parallel to that, this group called the Taliban who were hosting them. And that really begins this process of introducing these groups and ideas to a much broader audience, the world, but also beyond that, sets in motion in the years thereafter a process of a splintering within the movement and this sort of spreading not just of all kinds of ideas relating to the broader question of how should Muslims govern themselves? What should a political Islamic entity look like? Is this called a caliphate? Is it called an emirate? Is it called something else? And you can see, again, across the different case studies in the book that there are all these very different forms in terms of how political Islamic groups manifest themselves, from groups who seek to act and operate constitutionally by contesting elections in their local areas, all the way through to groups such as Islamic State in Syria and Iraq, which sought to fundamentally challenge and overthrow everything about the prevailing system, not just in terms of where they were operating and the territory that they were taking, but also in terms of the international system within which they were operating. So there was no sense or desire or discussion from them to be, for example, recognized on the international arena, to achieve a seat, for example, at the UN or anything like that. It was much more dramatic in terms of what it was seeking to do and the ways in which it was seeking to overturn that established order. So in that immediate aftermath then of the sort of post 9/11 climate, you get what is really an explosion of theology and law and discussion from various movements who begin to articulate and explain why it is they're doing what they're doing. And we talk about this in the introduction to the volume, where we explore this concept of Tawheed al-Hakimiyya. And that's really, really important. So to pull this back for the audience, the whole concept of Tawheed relates to the monotheism of God. If you were to distill the whole concept of Islam to one idea, it's the idea of Tawheed, that sense of the unitary oneness of God, or monotheism in that sense. And Muslims believe that the monotheism of God, the Tawheed of Allah, must be satisfied in a number of different ways. So some of those are just intellectual affirmations. If you believe in the notion of God as an omnipotent being who has no beginning and no end, who is self-sustaining and so on, that's an intellectual affirmation that you make through belief in an attribute of God. But there are different ways to also satisfy other beliefs in God, such as through ritual acts, prayer, fasting, performing pilgrimage, giving charity, and all of these different types of things. And so what has emerged is somewhat of a, and I should say it's a contested neologism within the sort of jihadist movement, is this notion of Tawheed al-Hakimiyya. Some theorists reject it, some say it exists as a sort of branch of other more established fields of Tawheed, but what's really important for those who pursue it in the contemporary political setting is that they say this notion of satisfying God's rights, God's attributes as the lawgiver, the one who decides what is right and what is wrong, and so on, is not being achieved today because there is no authentic, again, however that might be constructed, Islamic State. And therefore, that aspect of God's Tawheed, that aspect of God's monotheism is deficient. It's not being satisfied correctly by Muslims, and therefore you have to isolate it, create this notion of Tawhid al-Hakimi, and establish an Islamic political system through which you then are able to realize that aspect of God's monotheistic attributes. So you need a state that is conservatively governed by the rules and edicts of Islam, again, however those are constructed. And you'll hear from Aaron, for example, with a group like Nahda, which would imagine and shape its own version of what an Islamic state might look like and how it might interpret Islamic rules as being completely different to the way a group like the Taliban, for example, or Islamic State might interpret those same ideas. And even those two groups, which we lump together quite often, Al-Qaeda and ISIS, would themselves differentiate amongst themselves in terms of how they see some of this. What also became very clear to us as we then put on the book, having established that impetus for the sort of political Islamic cause for why these groups are sort of seeking to achieve what it is that they're after, is that this is a highly metastasizing and dynamic movement. It's certainly not been static. And that's, of course, to make the point that these groups have existed, a number of different groups have existed in one form or another ever since the collapse of the Ottoman Empire more than 100 years ago. So for them to exist for that long and to also be durable for that period of time, to have withstood state repression, executions, a global war on terror, all of these different things, means that they have to be quite dynamic, quite light-footed, and able to react to things that are happening around them. And you could see that again very dramatically in the immediate aftermath of the post-2011 uprisings, was that a number of movements that had been repressed, that had been forbidden from participating in the political systems in their countries, such as the Muslim Brotherhood, of course, in Egypt, and Nahda in Tunisia, Brotherhood offshoots in Libya and elsewhere, began to now assert themselves into the political system in order to try and contest elections, in order to try and realize power through those elections, and to essentially seek to put their hands on the levers of power in that way. And of course, most dramatically, Nahda and the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood do realize power in different ways in their countries, before a degree of democratic backsliding in both countries again. But again, I'll let Aaron speak to his specific case study. It's also become quite clear, again, is that there's a lot of moral panic underwriting these groups in terms of the way that they're seeking to project what it is they're doing. And again, the 2011 uprisings and indeed the sort of post-war on terror years, again, intensify that debate about what an Islamic polity should look like. How does it construct itself? How does it organize itself in relation to what's happening around it? And so again, you can see with regards to non-state actor groups, for example, such as Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, operating in northwestern Syria, again, in the ways it's trying to organize a sort of self-autonomous system and structure there, implement its own system of courts, and other sort of civic administration in that region in order to respond to people's concerns and issues, which sits distinctly different to things around it. Similarly, you see that with the return to power of the Taliban in Afghanistan, who've often justified things such as the denial of education to women and girls through saying there are cultural concerns and that there are societal and social considerations that they are thinking about in relation to that particular issue. So there's been a lot of discussion about moral panic and the role of moral panic within these movements, again, in the ways that in which they're trying to explain and justify how they are taking power and shaping power. And interestingly enough, as Joanna mentioned, we also have a sort of final section of the book, which is looking at how states are sometimes responding to these groups and pushing back against them. And you can see quite clearly in the case of Saudi Arabia and some of the changes being implemented under the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, better known as MBS, again, how different contestations are taking place within that country, again, around the issue of social norms, convention, and moral panics around issues such as public entertainment, which again are very, very prominent in the public debate at this moment in time. What's also, I suppose, the final sort of section that we're looking at, I think is really interesting, again, showing or drawing out a few interesting points about the movement as a whole, is that what's been very clear as well from the lesson of all of these uprisings, whether they were 2011 or the post 9/11 climate, is that it has all sort of further helped the jihadist narrative, which is that even in the case of peaceful uprisings and so on, there has to be a reservation for violence. There has to be a hinterland which can be called upon in order to launch an armed response to the state. And of course, Syria was the most dramatic country in which that narrative became incredibly strong, to say, no, look, we have to stand violently against the state, because simply protesting peacefully won't get you there. But of course, Libya was another case, and we've seen similar sort of moves towards violence in other parts of the world, Yemen and elsewhere as well. So it has, in a sense, despite seeing that notion of people power, of popular uprisings, removing what seemed like fairly entrenched and immovable states, actually still needing, as it were, that recourse to power. And even in a country like Egypt, of course, that narrative is quite strong, because, of course, after the Muslim Brotherhood realized power, it was also removed from power through a coup, through the army, which has effectively reinstalled itself into power. And so again, in that context, there's been a lot of hand-wringing within the movement to say, look, even when you do operate within the system, it creates these vulnerabilities where the old entrenched systems and power of the state might still seek to work against you. So all of this is to say, I think the takeaways that we achieve from the book is that there are a number of tensions that exist, both politically within the environments in which these groups are operating, also within these movements, about the best way to realize, to seek, to achieve power, and to hold on to it as well. Of course, that's a very important aspect of it. A number of these groups have been a bit like shooting stars. They came and they went very, very quickly. And more broadly is to say that the movement itself is highly dynamic. It has shown itself to be resilient and durable, but that's really been born of the fact that it has been very, very nimble on its feet, and it's responding and reacting to things that happen. So movements like Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which have been offshoots of what might traditionally have been called Al-Qaeda, have shown themselves to be dramatically pragmatic in the way that they are seeking to hold power in the Northwest, all the way through to, again, a group like An-Nahda, which we'll hear about more shortly, which is, again, demonstrated a degree of pragmatism in the way it's sought to rule and to establish itself in those countries. And it's worth saying that even the Taliban now, in terms of their return to power, have clearly sought to, at least internationally, in the way they're interacting with international stakeholders, again, try to project an image of greater pragmatism and malleability in terms of the way they seek to hold relations with others. So, as I said, we assembled these 16 case studies to give that real sense of how does that sense of theological, ideological pragmatism manifest itself through a number of different countries, and the way that these groups are then able to seek to really hold on in ways that would be unexpected in order to persist in the pursuit of their goals. And so with that, I'll hand back to you, Joanna, to pass over to our next speaker.
Sure, well, I'll just keep the baton going then, and I'll hand it over to Meryl for her demonstration presentation. Thank you, Meryl.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much, Joanna and Shiraz, for inviting me on this panel, and also for allowing me to contribute to this book. I'm very, very glad today to present to you Chapter 8 of the book, entitled Local Governance as a Delegitimizing Tool for Competing Violent Extremist Groups in Central Mali, a chapter that I co-authored with my former ICCT colleague, Julie Coleman. And to begin with, I would like to just take a quick look at the context to understand why Central Mali is such a relevant case study. Well, first, it is located in the Sahel, which has become the epicenter of violent extremism globally. It has recorded over 40% of terrorism deaths last year, and that represents more than South Asia, the Middle East, and North Africa combined. As you can see on the graph and on the map, Mali itself has recorded a dramatic rise in terrorist violence. That has notably concentrated in the central regions and the three border area with Niger and Burkina Faso. I would say as well that the political upheaval and the succession of coups that we have seen in recent years in the region have not improved the situation. While the putschists that have taken power in many countries in the region have often claimed to do so, at least partly because of previous elected governments' inability to address the threat of violent extremism, they have actually proved quite incapable as well, if not more, to address this threat with the number of attacks, and particularly the number of civilian casualties only increasing. Besides these high levels of terrorist violence, what also makes Central Mali a particularly interesting case is also the myriad of non-state armed actors that exist in the region, including different self-defense groups, communal militias, and violent extremist groups that often compete both the state and with each other for territorial control and for power. Next slide, please. So within this context, the chapter is an attempt at unfolding the role that local governance has played in jihadist groups' ability to gain ground in Central Mali, both generally, but also more specifically in the context of increasing intergroup rivalries. So it asks the question of whether and how governance provision has been used by violent extremist groups as a tool to both assert their own legitimacy as well as to undermine those of rival groups. And for that, we have decided to focus on two specific organizations. The first one being the Katiba Messina, which is a group present in Central Mali and is a member of the broader Al-Qaeda affiliated Janim network, and the Islamic State in the Greater Sahara, ISGS, which is also commonly referred to as ISIS Sahel. Next slide, please. So being mindful of the time here, I won't be able to go into too many details, but I still wanted to present you three key ideas that have been discussed in the chapter. First, it delves into how state governance deficits in Central Mali have proved instrumental for violent extremist groups to gain ground in the region. It explores how groups both linked to Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State have been able to exploit existing grievances around the lack of access to basic services, the lack of economic opportunities, and more generally, a sense of abandonment by the state. It also looks at the very local level, where groups have also been able to exploit frustrations against a rather rigid social structure, and grievances against traditional elites that have often been regarded as complicit in their government corruption. And in a context marked by intense competition over the access to land and natural resources, groups have also been able to build upon existing intercommunal tensions, head past farmer conflicts and tensions over the regulation of land ownership, for example. Then it also explores how Islamist governance has materialized in the region, and especially how it has evolved over time. What we've seen in central Mali and in other regions in recent years has been quite different from the more overt control exerted by jihadist groups such as AKIM, the Mujao, and Ansar-Din in the early days of the crisis, who have been able to take control of major northern Malian cities for a short period of time before being chased out from urban centers by French Operation Serval in 2013. And since then, groups have rather built on what is often described as a system of shadow governance, which is an approach that has notably consisted in establishing bases in remote, rural areas, ensuring a more discrete presence, and generally trying to co-opt or coerce existing governance structures to run daily affairs, while making sure that they do so on the Islamist group's terms. It has also involved the provision of some minimal services, such as attempts at dispute resolution, justice provision, and the regulation of access to natural resources. And what we see is that while the scope and the effectiveness of such services generally seems quite limited, given the fact that the populations had been confronted for years to the absence of the state, the ability of the groups to fulfill some minimal governance functions have still allowed them to gain some level of legitimacy. What is important to note here as well is that the provision of governance has not been free of violence. Violent extremist groups in the region have also violently enforced their code of conduct. They have outlawed many common aspects of life, including imposing severe restrictions on women's rights and mobility, and targeting actors that do not abide by the rules. So they have both resorted to violence and concurrently used the provision of governance to assert their authorities. And finally, what this chapter argues is that jihadist groups have also been able to adapt their governance strategies to outbid competing groups in a context of increased intergroup rivalries. In fact, the Sahel had stood for a while as the only region where Al-Qaeda and Islamic State affiliates had largely avoided direct confrontations and might have, in some instances, coordinated on an ad hoc basis. And that has led many to talk about a Sahel exception. But dynamics have evolved, and as of mid-2019, they have turned into open clashes. And in this context, what we see is that the competition between groups like the Katiba Masina and ISIS Sahel have not only been playing out in the battlefield, but the groups have also tried to differentiate themselves, to discredit the others, and have notably used local governance to do so. So the chapter then dives into some of the key distinctions between the Katiba Masina and the ISIS Sahel styles of governance, which I'm happy to describe in more details in the Q&A, but just to give you an idea, these distinctions include differences in their approach to pasture land management and taxation, so usage fees that are paid by herders to access grazing lands, Their approaches to local intercommunal conflicts, and particularly their readiness to engage in retaliations against certain communities or communal militias, and as well their approach to existing governance structures, and particularly the issue around negotiations with local authorities. Next slide, please. So, what are some of the key takeaways of this chapter? I think it clearly appears that violent extremist groups in the central regions of Mali have not solely relied on violence. They have capitalized on local grievances, have provided forms of local governments to appear as alternatives to what is a largely absent state. And the way they have in which they have governed has varied over time and have also varied from group to group. Rather than implementing a very strict ideological model or a playbook, Islamic State and Al-Qaeda affiliated groups seems to have been able to constantly adapt their way of governing to the local context, to changing conflict dynamics, including, but not limited to, the pressure exerted by counter-terrorism efforts. We've seen that in the aftermath of the Operation Serval, that forced group out of cities and confined them to kind of a more opaque style of governance, and also have adapted to the rise of inter-jihadist competition. This chapter concludes that local governance provision does seem to be a useful tool for rival groups to gain some level of legitimacy and support, and also undermine their rivals. So that was a very, very brief overview. Thank you for listening, and I'm of course happy to answer any questions after the last presentation.
Thank you very much for this excellent case study, Meryl. We're really pleased to have it in the book here. And I will hand it over to Aaron for a case study now from Tunisia.
Great. Thank you so much. Hopefully everybody can see my presentation. Before I begin, I wanted to just thank Joanna and Shiraz again for asking me to write a chapter in this book, as well as being part of this book launch. So I really appreciate it. Good to see you guys as well. So in October 2011, after the Tunisian revolution, Tunisia's main Islamist group, Ennahda, would win a plurality in the initial constituent assembly elections, illustrating the marked changes from the state-enforced secularism that we've seen in Tunisia going all the way back to its independence in 1956. This new space provided by the democratic opening in 2011, however, also led to jihadis being able to take advantage of the situation, and only a few months after it, creating a new jihadi group called Ansar al-Sharia in Tunisia, or AST. And it established itself in a really unprecedented overt manner. AST played an indirect yet important role in the various discussions and debates that would animate the political processes and subsequent writing of Tunisia's new constitution. In any other situation, AST would have been considered an illegal organization due to its ideological outlook, especially since it was an Al-Qaeda front group, and its medium to long-term ambitions of creating an Islamic State. Though the group thrived until the Tunisian government, eventually led by Ennahda, designated as a terrorist group August 27, 2013, so about a decade ago now. The case of Ennahda provides an informative example of a ruling Islamist party's response to jihadis in a democratic setting, both directly and indirectly. The Ennahda-led government's policy vis-a-vis AST could operate and expand its influence. Ennahda's engagement policy with AST, as well as its attempt to position itself closer to sort of conservative Islamists in the debate over the constitution, allowed AST to exploit the political and social situation. Although Ennahda and AST could argue within the same Islamic and Islamist discourse in a way a secular government, let alone a liberal Western government, could not, AST and their fellow travelers never had any intention of being co-opted by Ennahda's so-called light touch policy. The outcome of Ennahda's policy suggests that a soft approach when dealing with jihadis does just as little to curb their growth as the sort of indiscriminate crackdowns that we saw from previous Tunisian President Ben Ali. Through its experience in power and growing insecurity in Tunisia due to AST-led or related violence, Ennahda would eventually give up on this policy and begin to combat AST in the spring and fall of 2013. And since then, over the last decade, there's been no sign that Ennahda has deviated from this lesson. One of the main reasons for Ennahda's decision to take a light touch approach with AST was based on Ennahda's own experiences in the 1980s and 1990s, as Ennahda members suffered torture and repression under Ben Ali's regime. Its leadership believed that a similar approach to AST would isolate and marginalize the jihadi group and lead to an even greater radicalization. This led to what the founder of AST, Abu Ayyad al-Tunisi, described as so-called undeclared truce between the two groups. And just to give an example, over the next 2.5 years, AST was involved in a variety of different types of activities. Obviously, there's not enough time to get into specifically everything, but this is sort of the breadth of it throughout the whole country and the different types of activities. And then I'm just going to briefly go through some examples of what they look like. This, for example, is when they're doing their medical caravans to rural areas. After this, we saw larger conferences, smaller conferences in more neighborhood areas. Here they're providing, social services and food and medicine and other, ideological literature to people eventually. And then here's just, regular protests that they would conduct against the government. This truce allowed AST to focus on its dawah activities as long as its members were not involved in violence. Nevertheless, despite AST's failure to adhere to these conditions, the Tunisian government did not fully respond to violations until AST's designation. According to Rashid Ghannouchi, the founder of the group, Ben Ali's actions against Ennahda in the 1980s late 1980s and early 1990s were not sustainable policies, as Ennahda would assume a leading role in politics after the revolution. If Ennahda chose to replicate the same policies as Ben Ali, Ghannouchi argued that, quote, in 10 to 15 years, maybe these jihadi Salafis would be in power, end quote. Ennahda felt a responsibility to bring these supposedly misguided youth back into the mainstream society. Hamidi Jebali, the Tunisian prime minister at the time, even went so far as to say that, quote, they're sons of Tunisia and they're not from Mars, end quote. Therefore, from Ennahda's perspective, it was necessary to give these jihadi youth opportunities for advice, dialogue, reintegration into the political system. There are a number of reasons why Ennahda allowed groups like AST to operate and flourish. There was a discrepancy between the leadership's more pragmatic approach and its more activist bases yearning for greater religiosity after the era of suppression under Bourguiba and Ben Ali. Therefore, it was necessary to allow jihadi Salafis to express themselves to alleviate pressure on the party. It was also a way to convince the secular left opposition that without Ennahda, religious extremism would flourish in Tunisia. For instance, Habib al-Luz, an Ennahda preacher from Sfax, took part in the Salafi dialogue called for a law against blasphemy to avoid so-called provocations by secular left intellectuals and artists. This, he argued, would deter extremism, where he said, quote, if you want to see more al-Qaeda supporters in Tunisia, then be flexible on blasphemy, end quote. Ultimately, Ennahda would be defeated on this issue and others between 2012 and 2014, including using Sharia as a source of law in the Constitution, defining the status of women as different from men, and creating a blasphemy provision. In part, these failures occurred because Ennahda only maintained a plurality rather than a majority of the vote in the Constituent Assembly. More importantly, one of the main reasons for its defeat was AST's low-level public violence and shows of restraints, which pushed the secular left parties to block the passage of such measures. This was due to fears that Ennahda was slowly transforming Tunisia into a conservative Islamic state, similar to the dynamics that were happening in Egypt when the Muslim Brotherhood took power in 2012. Ennahda's views and actions towards AST spurred many on the secular left to criticize the double standard on which the judicial system and security services operated. In particular, officials responded more tolerantly to violent acts committed by jihadi Salafis than to alleged provocations by intellectuals and artists. For example, there was a secular individual who was sentenced to 7 years in prison for allegedly promoting atheism, while a member of AST who tore down the Tunisian flag and replaced it with AST's black flag received a 6-month suspended sentence. Both involve the issue of free speech in many ways. However, the latter can be construed as vandalism. Nonetheless, there was a major discrepancy in these sentencings. Likewise, secular protests against violence are called off by the government, while AST planned protests were allowed. Although the police would attack or crack down upon secular protests, they appeared to play a protective role at protests conducted by AST. In a similar vein, Ennahda once ordered the closure of an art gallery in La Marsa, a suburb of Tunis, after jihadi Salafis rioted against the allegedly blasphemous artwork, while at the same time allowing an illegal sit-in by conservative Islamists to go on for almost 3 months at the state television station. AST aimed to exploit this naivete over the duration of Ennahda's time in power, such as what occurred at AST's founding conference, the October 2011 Nesma TV riots, the winter 2011-12 Manuba College niqab protests, and the March 2012 Sharia demonstration in Tunisia, as pictured on the right side of the slide. Just as AST had the space to organize openly, potential foreign fighters had little trouble traveling abroad. The Ennahda government was occasionally concerned, but also apathetic about individuals going to fight abroad. It's possible that some Ennahda members sympathized with the cause of overthrowing the Assad regime, both because of their own experiences shaking off the yoke of a dictator and overall humanitarian concerns associated with the Assad regime's industrial scale killing. It is also possible that ideological affinity played a role, since some key Syrian opposition members that promoted their cause internationally were associated with the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood. The seminal moment at which Ennahda's government began to shift its perception of AST was after an attack on the US Embassy in Tunis on September 14, 2012. And these are some of the images from inside of the compound at the time. However, not even the assassination by a member of AST of the secular left leader of the Democratic Patriots United Party, Shukri Belaid, on February 6, 2013, led to an outright crackdown. What truly altered Ennahda's calculus was the political backlash from the secular left in response to the assassination, which threatened Ennahda's ability to maintain power. Their very legitimacy was at stake. Al-Jabali decided to resign at this point as prime minister, and following months, Ennahda put far more pressure on AST, especially when the group began to plan its annual conference for May 2013. Unlike before, Ennahda began to enforce the requirement that AST obtain licenses for its Dawah activities and the annual conference. These legal actions allowed Ennahda to exert control over AST and limit its ability to openly operate. In part, these new policies aim to send a message about the true holders of power and allow Ennahda to exercise the levers of decision-making in the country. By then, AST was becoming a threat to not only the intellectual and artist class on the secular left, but also to Ennahda's religious legitimacy as well. In light of AST assassination of yet another secular left politician, Mohammed Brahmi, the founder and leader of the People's Movement Party, in July 25th, 2013, as well as an AQIM attack a few days later that left 8 Tunisian soldiers brutally murdered, the biggest attack against Tunisians historically up to that point, Ennahda decided to finally turn on AST and stop its ability to operate. At the end of August 2013, then the Ennahda government legally designated AST as a terrorist organization, preventing its ability to operate openly and ending the conditions that allowed it to grow. Of course, the 2.5-year time period during which AST operated more or less without consequence, it had provided other possible avenues for jihadi Salafis to then continue their movement after they're designated. Members of AST either decided to quit the movement outright and return to their regular lives. Others were arrested and went to prison. Others joined up with AQIM in the western mountains of Tunisia or in Algeria to fight the Tunisian government more directly. And then, as we know, many others became foreign fighters in Libya, Syria, and Mali. And as a consequence of this, then there were more attacks in Tunisia, like the one in the Sousse Beach attack or the Bardo Museum, most notably. As a consequence of unsuccessfully dealing with AST and the foreign fighter mobilization, alongside other issues, including the continued poorly managed economy in the next election for the Assembly of Representatives of the People in the fall in 2014, in the next election, Ennahda lost out as the leading political party this time, which moved to the conservative secular party, Nida Tunis. Since then, over the last 9 years, Ennahda's hardened stance toward jihadism, as described in a showdown with AST, has remained resolute. They haven't gone back on it. Even after, again, winning a plurality of the vote in the fall of 2019 election for the Assembly of Representatives of the People, Ennahda's policies haven't reverted to how it sort of dealt with the jihadis from 2011 to 2013. Therefore, the case of Ennahda in power and how it dealt with the jihadi movement is one of learning from past mistakes, which many of them later admitted. Reflecting on this dynamic in 2019, the Ennahda parliamentarian Samir Dalu said that, quote, "There was a debate between human rights and security, but we took more time than we should have to start arresting members of the group," end quote. So even if Ennahda may have enabled AST or the foreign fighter mobilization, initially it realized that it was not only a threat to its own power and space within the newly democratic Tunisian system, but the broader health and stability of Tunisia as a whole. It would be wise for other Islamist movements to heed Ennahda's experience and not make similar mistakes, especially ones that might come to power in future democratic transition scenarios. When considering the question of an Islamist party's response to jihadis in the democratic setting, it highlights that there is a gap between what is like or acceptable to act as a social movement versus what is expected as a governing entity. It also illustrates that there are potential for negative consequences for policies taken, even if it is believed to be done in good faith. It's also worth considering the role that Tunisia's civil society and opposition political parties play in pushing back against Ennahda's original light touch approach. If not for the democratic give and take, as well as the strength of these opposition forces, it could have neutered any chances that Ennahda could learn from its policy failures. Therefore, in many ways, the success of an Islamist party governing in a democratic setting is tied just as much to the vibrancy of those within society not leading the government. This balance allows groups like Ennahda to negotiate new settings, while also illustrating its adherence to a more democratic norm instead of attempting to monopolize the space against ideological enemies. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Aaron, for the case study from Tunisia. The two from Mali and Tunisia are a really good example of the kind of diverse expertise and contours that the case studies that we included in the book really highlight about the theme of Islamist governance. And I think we have about a half hour now for Q&A, and this will be a great opportunity to really dig into this a little bit more. So the first question I have here is from Shigaye, who asks about the main focus of the book. I've just put a link in the chat, so everyone can get have a look at the full contents of the book on the HRSA website. But there are 16 chapters, each with very unique case studies from around the world. So I do encourage you to have a look at that. The second question looks at Tariqa Lepek in Pakistan, this question is from Mirza, who notes that the group is gaining prominence in Pakistan, and they belong to the Barlevi school of thought, which is quite opposed to Salafi or Deobandi school of thought. And do we see any chance of these two schools of thought being involved in any kind of clash in the future? And I think perhaps we will maybe turn this question over to Shiraz for a first comment here before moving down to the question from Beshoy, please.
Thanks, Joanna. Thanks for that question. It's really interesting. I want to preface this by saying I'm not, and I don't think any of the other speakers are real experts on Pakistan. I have a bit of insight there, but we do have some contributions in the book itself from people who both look at and live in Pakistan. But I think it's worth saying, this type of question also came up a lot in relation to the area that I do study, which has been Syria and Iraq, looking at both ISIS and Al-Qaeda there, where people were hypothesizing in the past, well, could they merge? Could they form some sort of supercharged terrorist movement? And there was quite a sort of divide even amongst respected experts in terms of what that would look like and whether it was possible or not. But I think, I mentioned in my opening remarks this notion of moral panic, this sense of we must stand in opposition to the West as a political entity and also Western culture and all of those kinds of things. And if you look at the main kinds of issues on which a movement like Tehreek al-Labbaik Pakistan is achieving traction, and the kind of key issues on which they are seeking to mobilize publicly and establish a sort of name for themselves publicly, then it doesn't strike me that even though they have kind of doctrinal beliefs that are different to the Taliban, that there would naturally be a clash, though, right? So those issues stand on things like blasphemy laws in Pakistan, the role of minorities in Pakistan, whether that's Christian minorities or other groups that have traditionally been persecuted, such as the Ahmadi group and others. So it doesn't seem likely to me that, given that those are the sort of key touchstone issues on which that movement is establishing itself, that you'd find a group like the Taliban, for example, or Al Qaeda or others, opposing them, saying, "Well, that's outrageous. We have strong differences of opinion with you on those." In fact, whilst the doctrinal issues, when you're really getting into the nitty-gritty of the way that these guys interpret the Islamic Aqidah, the belief structure, and so on, that might be areas of difference, but those aren't the aspects on which either group, in fact, is campaigning or seeking to impose itself on the public space politically. So on those issues, I would say, where they do impose themselves in the public sphere, blasphemy laws, conservative imposition of Islamic rules on society, the role of minorities, and those kinds of things, they're broadly in alignment. And I think that, for now at least, suggests a sort of deconfliction rather than move towards a conflict. But as I say, that's a sort of caveated answer, with the understanding that I'm not an expert on this movement, or indeed on the way these groups are operating within Pakistan.
Great. Thank you so much, Shiraz. And I have put in the Q&A a reference to our Pakistani expert in the book as well. So you're welcome to follow up on the chapter that she's written and with the author herself. So the next question we have is from Beshoy. It's a really great question. What insights have we gleaned from the book in terms of how we can leverage these findings to craft more informed and impactful counterterrorism policies? And I will open it up to any of the participants to respond to this. But I think just based on two quick insights that I've had that I think are quite relevant to counterterrorism is that the first is that particularly when we're looking at non-state actors, and this is something that Meryl's chapter really highlights quite well, is that the ongoing importance of weak and absent governance and the kind of the opportunities to exploit these vacuums of power, which non-state actors continue to exploit. Almost all of the actors that we looked at in the group that were non-state actors really took advantage of situations of very weak or absent governance, and it does really highlight to me the importance of really looking at bolstering and supporting good governance practices and things as basic as providing those social welfare services, the legitimacy of government actors and so forth, because it is the frequency with which these actors have been able to exploit those is quite notable, and something that I think could be focused on in more of a preventative fashion. And the second reflection that I was having as I was reading through the question was that a lot of these governance projects, one thing that was quite notable to me in almost all of these cases, again, was how these governance projects really impact on different populations. And so in the chapter that I did, I looked at the case of women, in particular, and how governance projects under ISIS and Al Qaeda really distinctly impacted on women, and whether it's looking at how minority groups are engaged with and treated in pursuit of these governance projects, or whether populations such as women themselves are treated in pursuit of these governance projects are really, really quite important. And I think tell us a lot about what those governance aims are, but also if they have the opportunities to impose those, what the impacts and implications for different actors will be. And I think that hasn't really been examined sufficiently. So those are two kind of quick findings that I had in terms of things that would be more useful from a policy perspective to think about. So in those prevention policies, for example, thinking a little bit more about the impacts and implications for different minority groups as well. But perhaps Shiraz, I'll turn it over to you. And then if Aaron or Meryl wants to add anything, I'd invite you to do so as well.
Thanks, Joanna. Yeah, I think the big takeaway really for me is that after all these various convulsions, whether it's been 2 decades of the war on terror, a decade plus of the aftermath of the Arab uprisings and all of the various quite febrile sort of responses that have happened to these events, we've sort of gone back to a period of localization. And I think that's what I was trying to say in my opening remarks, that these groups are increasingly looking inwards to their locality. There's less of that bombastic talk about, conquering Rome and Constantinople, marching troops down to the White House or Downing Street to raise the black flag and all of that kind of stuff. That, as hyperbolic as those statements were, there was that notion of launching attacks in the West, of instigating these types of things. And I think there's a recognition of the fact that, once you do that, it catalyzes Western political responses, and which then harm your ability to act and operate on the ground in your locality. And you can see that in terms of both the way the Taliban have been speaking since their return to power. They've been quite clear in their messaging to say, we want good relations with everybody. We're not going to upset the status quo. Have shied away in public statements from even when being asked about, something like Kashmir, which is on their doorstep, to say that's an issue between Pakistan and India. It's not for us to get involved with, and so on. So again, who knows where that goes over time, but for now, at least the messaging is clearly there. Similarly, in northwestern Syria with Jolani, again, you've seen statements, and I think over a period of time, the reality as well, which is that northwestern Syria has not been allowed to be used as a launch pad for external operations. And that is born of a recognition that, were people dying on the streets of Berlin, Paris, London, elsewhere, in the way that they were due to IS, Islamic State, inspiring or sending people to conduct those attacks, that's a pretty good and quick way to lose your ability to control the local area. So there's that sense of localization that is creeping back in to these spaces. And then I think that for me is the big takeaway. It's almost like it's a score draw for each side, and therefore everyone's walking away, sort of saying, okay, let's let the status quo exist. And that for me, in a sense, is the, to your question about counterterrorism and what lessons we should draw, there's a pro and a con there, right? So the pro is you get that immediate short-term dip in the attack. There's no immediate incentive today to sort of attack the West or to launch attacks and so on. But at the same time, the longer these ungoverned spaces persist, or indeed governed spaces which are hostile towards us and so on, then the potential for something to spill over quite quickly has been demonstrated in the past.
Great, thank you, Shiraz. And Aaron, Meryl, any reflections on what your case studies may have in relation to counterterrorism considerations?
Yeah, if I can go. I think for me, one of the main lessons from the Malian case is a few different points. I think the resilience of violent extremist groups in the region and their resilience to different efforts being implemented to counter them. It's been a decade in the region, and the 10 plus years of trying to counter these groups have mostly focused on security actors, kinetic approaches, and not really addressing the governance issues that have not only allowed these groups to have an opening, but also to continue to gain ground in the region. I think another and related aspect is that I think one of the issue is that the international community continues to approach the Sahel through a very Western-centric approach, and that not be includes equating authority, a state, with central states, which does not really apply to a region like the Sahel. And I think that leads, for example, the international community to often advocate for the return of the state in areas where it has been absent, except that there's also the challenge of local communities and the fact that this option is not necessarily the preferred one for communities that perceive the state as a predatory institution. it also completely overshadows the fact that there are multiple sources of formal and informal authorities in remote regions. There are local actors that still retain some level of legitimacy. There is civil society organizations, and I think even if it's challenging, especially in regions where many countries are now led by military regimes that are quite hostile to Western interventions, there should be a way to continue to maintain both dialogue and also direct assistance for those local actors to be able to continue to support local communities in what they know how to do. So, conflict resolution, mediation, social cohesion, providing for the basic needs of populations. Yeah, I think those two are probably two key takeaways from the case studies that I worked on.
In case of Tunisia, I think it's unique because a lot of what was happening was during a transition between authoritarian rule to hopeful democratic consolidation. Obviously, as we know, since there's been a political coup in Tunisia a couple of years ago, so it's kind of gone backwards. But at least for a decade, there was hope and promise there. One of the first things which I didn't have time to mention in my presentation is that in the aftermath of the revolution in Tunisia, there was a general prison amnesty. While it is true, and I agree that political opponents should have been left out of prison, I think those that have been charged for sort of past terrorism-related crimes probably should have been looked at again, maybe to double check to make sure whether it was actually legitimate or it was more politically motivated. So that's one thing, going forward when you're thinking about sort of transitions, because had those, I think, 1,300 or so jihadis not been let out of prison, it's highly unlikely that the mobilization that we then saw locally for those 2.5 years would have gotten as large as it did, let alone then the mobilization to become foreign fighters abroad in other, actual war theaters. And then the second one is, I think, I mentioned this in my presentation, is that I think there needs to be sort of this Goldilocks approach to dealing with these types of groups domestically. Obviously, in the past, in the case of Tunisia under Bourguiba and then Ben Ali, there was this over-the-top crushing of these organizations, imprisoning more people than necessary, torturing people, getting families swept up in it, not using human rights at all. But on the other hand, sort of just allowing these groups to operate openly without much consequence, even if they are, doing activities that are against the law, provides the space for them to take advantage of it, especially when a government's being a bit naive, possibly. Therefore, I think a middle approach where it's really intelligence-led law enforcement approach in a domestic front. Obviously, you need to build up the capabilities to do this in a smart manner. And it's something that, Tunisia by around 2019 was really able to get to in a robust manner in a way it hadn't previously. Obviously, unfortunately, it's backslid since then, but I think that's the end goal, instead of something over the top or not enough at all.
Great. Thanks a lot, Aaron. The next two questions are focused actually on the case studies of Tunisia and Mali, and I know you've both discussed aspects of this a little bit, but both of the questions are curious about the distinctive factors or dynamics in each of those countries that really led to the emergence of jihadist movements. So in the case of Mali, referring to several of the coups that have occurred, and in Tunisia, just an open question about that in particular. So again, I know you both discussed aspects of this already, but is there anything else you'd like to maybe expand on in relation to the emergence of jihadist groups, or in particular contextual points that are distinct for both Tunisia and Mali? Thank you. Meryl, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, I think on the question of the coups that have happened in the Sahel, I mean, the groups were already there, but in recent years, we've seen in the whole region political destabilization and a coup happening in Mali, Burkina Faso, and very recently in Niger. So the three Sahel countries that are the most affected by violent extremism. And I think I mentioned during the presentation, many of the military junta that have led the coups and taken power, they have claimed to do it to provide a better answer to a deteriorating situation, and particularly the threat posed by terrorist groups in these countries. While for Niger, it's probably too soon still to see exactly what the impact will be. In the case of Mali and Burkina Faso, I mean, we see that the situation has further deteriorated since the coup. I think there has been a five-fold increase in the number of attacks that have been carried out as compared to the year before the coup. And that is related to different factors. The first being that military junta are usually focusing on securing their own power in the short term, focusing their attention on capital cities and usually creating a void in remote regions where violent extremist group can take further ground and consolidate their presence. Consolidating their power can also be very challenging in some instances where there are very important divisions within the security apparatus itself. And maybe even more importantly, those coups have generally resulted in regimes cutting ties with international partners. In Mali, that has translated notably in the withdrawal of the French Operation Barkhane, now impacting the MINUSMA, the UN mission there as well. And all of that has had an impact on groups present on the ground. I think there was a recent ACLED report showing or warning that ISIS Sahel might be in the process of taking further control over territories and possibly working on the establishment of a proto-state in the True Border region. So I think it did have a very significant impact, and Niger coup could have further implications. The country is in the middle of the two main hotbeds of terrorism in the region, both affected by the Sahel groups and by the Lake Chad groups. So any severe deterioration of the situation in the country could really impact the broader region, including the coastal states that have already been impacted in recent years.
Aaron, please.
In terms of, yeah, of course. Thank you. So in terms of Tunisia, one of the norms of the movement overall has been that it's mainly been a diaspora movement in many ways, where Tunisians were involved in foreign fighting endeavors abroad, and they didn't really have many opportunities locally to operate due to the authoritarian nature of the various regimes over the years. So Tunisians had been involved in jihadism going all the way back to the anti-Soviet jihad in the 1980s, through helping out with the Algerian jihad in the 90s, as well as Chechnya and Bosnia. Many of them, after Afghanistan, went to Europe and started being involved in the networks there in terms of logistics, facilitation, creating forged documents for people to move between different areas. And then one of the big changes was during the Iraq War after 2003, where Tunisians no longer became just sort of these middlemen in the movement, but they started to garner more senior level positions, especially in the foreign fighter networks related to Al-Qaeda in Iraq and the Islamic State of Iraq, which would then be relevant to them later on following 2011 and the Syrian civil war. So after the revolution in Tunisia in 2011, though, as I said, all of these individuals who had been arrested locally were out of prison, and many others who had been in other foreign fighter theaters returned home, or those that had been in Europe returned home. And therefore, you had a group of people that had a bevy of organizational experience, and that's where they were able to hit the ground running very quickly. And then, of course, once they were designated in the fall of 2013, There was obviously opportunities next door in Libya with, the opening of that space towards its sister organization, Ansar al-Sharia in Libya, which was at the time, controlling territory in Derna and Benghazi, but then also provide a platform to train there before going to Syria to first join up with Jabhat al-Nusra, Al-Qaeda's branch at the time, and then later on the Islamic State. And as we know, Tunisians were one of the larger foreign fighter groups in that mobilization. And then, as a consequence of this, this was then redirected into terrorist attacks locally within Tunisia from 2014 through 2019 or so. Since 2020, it's more or less died down. Part of that is the consequence was of the professionalization of Tunisia's military as well as police forces. Of course, in the last 2 years, I'd say it's gotten worse just because of the coup in Tunisia. But because of the authoritarian nature, they've been able to suppress things. But as a consequence, you have a large cohort of Tunisians that had previously been involved in a lot of activity in the prison system within Tunisia, but also currently in the prison system in northeast Syria, run by the Syrian Democratic Forces, as well as women and children that are based in the IDP camps in northeast Syria. So if, the context changes or something happens, there is a cohort of people that would be able to potentially take advantage of this. So this is why it was so important for, the Tunisian state to progress towards, dealing with this issue in the rule of law, because it would have been far more sustainable over time because it would have had more legitimacy from the population. Whereas now with this backslide, there are a lot of questions over the legitimacy related to security forces and the judiciary and all the questions that happened before 2011 again. So for now, the movement's, not in a great place, but, time will tell what will happen in the future.
Great. Thank you very much, Aaron. We only have a few minutes left and we have two final questions, so I might just mention them both. And if any of the participants want to comment on them, we can put in some final words here. So the first is from Nigel, which asked about to what extent have experiences of governance by AQ or IS aligned organizations led to a relative mellowing in areas such as Sharia assertiveness, levels of targets of violence, media outputs, and so on by the wider respective movements. So are they moderating and what are the consequences of that? It's a really interesting question. And the second one from Carlos is looking at how Islamist governance might be comparable to other types of governance as well. So specifically, he's asking about Christian influence in society and political decisions in Latin America. So I think there is something interesting to maybe be explored in terms of how approaches to pursuing Islamist governance might also be reflected in other faith traditions as well. So whether we're looking at Christian approaches to governance or Jewish or Hindu, I mean, there are a lot of religiously based movements right now who, through a lot of legitimate political means, are really trying to impose and advance their kind of belief systems through governance means too. So it's not something we really look at in the book, but it is, I think, a really interesting area to perhaps explore a little bit further and a bit more of a cross-comparative assessment. But perhaps just to the last question by Nigel, then, any particular comments on moderation by these movements? Are they moderating at all, and what are the consequences of this? I mean, one of the examples that I've looked at historically, and we do include the case study of Yemen in the book as well. But it was interesting to see as well how with some of these groups, particularly those that have governed over an extended period of time in the same area, you do see them kind of adapt their own behaviors and their own communications and outreach and activities and so forth based on local responses as well. I mean, ultimately, in terms of governance, you do have to, win the hearts and minds of populations. You generally do have to, at some point, kind of get support from that population. And we have seen several of the cases in the book really try and adapt those, particularly in terms of the longevity they have in those regions and really trying to gain support for movements, whether that's increasing membership or just general support and acquiescence of populations as well. So one of the cases in the book that I think is quite interesting was looking at Ashley Jackson's chapter on the Taliban, which looks at their approaches to justice, education, and taxation, and really looking at some of the kind of granular detail about how that was adapted in different aspects and areas in the country over time as well. And Christopher Anzalone's chapter on Al-Shabaab as well was another good example of where and how they've approached the concept of jurisprudence and courts as well. But any other immediate comments from the other panelists in relation to adapting, moderation from these movements?
Maybe one quick comment on my side, because we've looked at Al-Qaeda and ISIS groups and how they've tried to adapt their approaches to one another. And I think what we've seen, at least in the time frame that we looked at, is rather the opposite, I would say. So you have had ISIS Sahel trying to challenge Al-Qaeda groups in some of its strongholds, and in some instances, it has managed to encourage defections from Al-Qaeda groups by presenting itself as more uncompromising, let's say. So, for example, when it comes to intercommunal conflicts, the Katiba Messina has sometimes, or the leadership has sometimes refrained or not being willing to directly engage in retaliations against self-defense groups, for example, and that has reportedly resulted in defections from its own ranks to join the Islamic State affiliate. You have kind of the same thing around the issue of negotiations. ISIS Sahel has denounced its rival readiness to open negotiations with local authorities and used it to discredit the Katiba Messina ability to represent an alternative. So I wouldn't really say that the competition between both has been moderating their approaches, but quite the contrary in some instances.
And then Aaron, anything else to add in there?
Sure. I mean, I don't think the Islamic State's changed at all. I think Al-Qaeda learned from the lessons of Iraq and tried to consider people's opinions more and being a bit more pragmatic. I wouldn't say moderate, but more pragmatic and have more of a long run approach to it. And then in the case of HTS, which broke away first from the Islamic State and then Al-Qaeda, they, again, I wouldn't say that they've moderated per se, but they're definitely far more pragmatic, and they've sort of left behind the global jihad and mainly focused on local jihad. So it's kind of a return to how it was maybe in the 1990s, all the way back to maybe the 1960s, if you look at the whole history of the movement. And as a consequence, they've decided to do things a bit more differently. But, you know, we're at the end of it, so we can't get into too many specifics about it. But when you're looking at sort of the three poles of the biggest groups, that's how I kind of perceive it nowadays, at least.
Right. And Shiraz, please have the final word.
Thanks. Problem going after Aaron is that was pretty much exactly what I was going to say. But actually, you know, and I don't think there is any necessary contradiction there between what Aaron was saying and Meryl was saying, because actually it comes back to where we started, is that there's a heavy localization going on with these groups, and they're responding to and reacting to local events. But I think at the macro level, and it's really important to distinguish that these groups are moving towards pragmatism rather than moderation. Moderation would tend to suggest an ideological change, but the pragmatism suggests a sort of move based on the reality in which you're finding yourself to try and achieve your goal, which is to hold on to power. Because as Aaron mentioned, you know, I think the lesson of Iraq 2003, which Al-Qaeda learned, was that it's not enough just to be present, but you have to try and find ways to maintain yourself. And that's again what ISIS learned as well, right? They had this huge territorial holding, which wrapped up pretty swiftly by the provocation to the West to come and attack them, but also because there was no sense of seeking to ever attempt to really govern by consent, which again, groups like HTS are trying to do. And just to expand the example, the Taliban, again, you can also see again, are sort of attempting outreach. So with regards to the Hazara Shia population in Afghanistan, again, there's been outreach there. There's been outreach with China, for example, who they need a lot of aid from. So overlooking the Uyghur issue, for example. But all of this is very pragmatic. In an area, again, with regards to women's education, which I talked about, there's no real need for them to be so pragmatic, right? There's no need for them to, or incentive for them to do anything other than what they've always done, which is that denial of education and rights to women and girls in that space. And indeed, not just in terms of education now, but there's been further restrictions in terms of them visiting certain areas of the country, such as nature reserves and so on. So there is, I think, a sort of illustration there that where there is a case to be made for sort of being pragmatic and therefore loosening some of your more doctrinaire views, these groups move towards that. But in areas where there isn't, then they are still sort of seemingly holding on as rigidly to that as before. And as I hand back to you, let me just firstly thank our two contributors who participated in the event. So thanks for being here and for your chapters. I know some of the other chapter authors have sort of logged in. So again, if you are one of those watching, thank you for your efforts as well. Thanks obviously to the team at ICCT for organizing the logistics of putting this event together as well. And so with that, I'll hand back to you, Joanna.
Right. No, it's been an absolute pleasure. And I'd like to also thank you, Shiraz, for being an excellent co-editor. It's been such a pleasure to work on this, this incredible project with you. And I'd like to thank the original funders, Gerda Henkel, and our publisher, Hearst and Oxford University Press, for supporting this as well. Hearst has very kindly offered a 30% off code for anybody who wants to buy the book as well. So the code is RULE30 if you would like to go out and get your own copy of this excellent book. And otherwise, a very big thanks to the audience for logging in today, and have a great day. Take care, folks.